Good morning. Welcome to the 2016 version of ADA training. How many people were here last year? For 14 hours, wasn't it? Oh wait, this was only 6. Today is a little bit shorter. Our presenter this morning has told me that he gears his presentations to adults, and it's easy and concise to understand, so we'll see about that. Well, I realize we still have some people in the back that are standing. Chairs are coming, so please be patient, but it's time that we got started. Chris Phelps is the training manager for Meeting the Challenge Incorporated. Possessing over 10 years of experience, Chris is responsible for the creation, preparation, and presentation of all ADA training for Mountain States? Close enough. Chris is skilled in all aspects of career development, team building, knowledge transition, coaching, mentoring, and focusing on training solutions. He is accomplished in presentations, as I said, in clear, concise, well-organized, written, verbal communications directly targeted for those of us in the audience who supposedly think of us as adults. Please help me welcome Chris Phelps.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. Man, it's bright up here. I feel like a rock star. I'm not going to lie to you. Like, I want to break into a chorus of memories or something like that and just make you guys sit here and listen, but I won't. So we're here today to talk about a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act. Like I said, I know some of you were here last year and you got to go through with Maggie. We're going to kind of hit most of the same topics. But before we get into all that, I do want to kind of point out that I am with the Rocky Mountain ADA Center. The Rocky Mountain ADA Center is under a grant. We do not, however, provide legal advice. We just provide guidance. So in the next hour, we want to look at the purpose of the ADA. Well, I say hour. What I really mean by that is about 30 minutes. We want to review a little history leading up to the ADA. We want to discuss who is covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're going to run through a quick overview of each of the titles of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're going to provide you with simple etiquette tips so that when you're interacting with people with disabilities, you know better what to do. So what is the Americans with Disabilities Act all about? Well, to answer that question, I want you to just imagine for a moment. I don't want you to think, I want you to imagine. I want you to imagine a time when people were not allowed employment opportunities, where businesses, restaurants, and city streets were off limits to some people. Maybe a time where communication was only important for selected individuals. Maybe a time where there were no laws that prohibited discrimination. Or a time when city streets, city transit systems were not allowed or not open for everyone. Where some people were flat out hidden and excluded. You imagining that time? Does a picture like this remind you of the time that you were thinking of? White men's restroom only. How about a picture like this, where women did not have the right to vote? Does that remind you of the time that you might have been thinking of? Or how about a picture like this, where not everyone was allowed to access what the rest of us would? Let's make no mistake about it. Segregation, discrimination are violations of the basic human rights, basic civil rights. And that's what the Americans with Disabilities Act is all about. It is simply a civil rights law. Nothing more. It's just a civil rights law. The ADA is about basic civil rights. It's about basic rights to enjoy the goods and services offered to everyone. It's about basic rights to communicate effectively, about basic rights to access the same areas that everyone can access. It's about the basic rights of enjoying the same activities offered in the community that everyone can enjoy. What is the ADA not about? It's not about free money. There are no provisions in the Americans with Disabilities Act for free money. We get that call all the time. Where do I get my free money? You don't get free money. There are other agencies out there that may provide assistance, but not the Americans with Disabilities Act. It doesn't provide better parking when you are utilizing a mobility device. You tell me how good your parking is, even if it is at the front of the building. It's not about political correctness. It's just about the right thing to do. There we go. And there's no special treatment. As we go through the Americans with Disabilities Act and we kind of focus in on a few different things, I defy you to find one thing in here that's special. That just because you have a disability that you get something special. Again, I defy you to find it. So let's talk a little history. And actually, we're going to make this a very, very quick little history because we're going to cut out a lot of this section. But you might be interested to find out that back in 1692, during the Salem witch trials, a lot of those people that were burned at the stake, yeah, they weren't witches. They were just people with disabilities. Believe it or not, there's really not a whole lot of history that led up, especially American history, when it comes to disabilities until we get to about 1817. And that's when we find our very first school for the deaf. And I won't go into all of it, but it was just thought that we didn't need a school for the deaf. They didn't need to learn. It wasn't that big a deal. Okay? They actually had to send somebody from the United States or from America to Europe to actually train to even learn how to teach, to learn sign language. Because sign language was just considered a bunch of random wavy noises or wavy things. So I'm sure after that, though, things started looking up, right? Not really. You still had things like P.T. Barnum's circus. All those freaks typically were just people with disabilities. In 1880, there was the conference that just flat out said, no, this isn't good. We don't want to bother with this junk. And I'll go quickly through some of these here, but it's one of my favorites. In 1883, eugenics, flat out, hey, let's just sterilize anybody with a disability. Because we don't want them breeding. Let's sterilize them. Oh, but don't worry, that was in 1883, right? Yeah. Do you know that some states didn't overturn this until the 70s? I'm sure things are getting better, though. In 1916, the National Defense Act, trying to help soldiers returning from war. And again, sorry, I'm skipping quickly because I'm trying to cut out some time. Here's one of my favorites. Supreme Court decided that forced sterilization of people with disabilities is not a violation of their constitutional rights. In the next 50 years, this continued to be in place. Social Security finally got passed in 1935. Oddly enough, President Roosevelt actually was a wheelchair user. Again, I'm sure you guys already knew that, but you never see him photographed in a wheelchair. I'm sure you can figure out why. In the 1940s, again, things started looking up a little bit, hopefully, right? We started passing things like, or we started creating the annual National Employee of the Handicap Week. Woohoo, got a whole week. In the 1950s is when things really started kind of moving a little bit, right? We're getting closer? No, maybe not. We did start seeing a few changes, and that's good. But there were still ugly laws. In some states, would not have been allowed to walk the streets. Okay? That's scary. Ugly laws. You're too ugly to walk the streets. In the 50s and 60s, we started seeing the civil rights era. And this is where things really did start to change, okay? At least with the laws. So we started getting things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which doesn't specifically discuss or deal with people with disabilities, but it did lay the foundation for. We had the Civil Rights Act of 65, which was basically the Voting Rights Act, fair housing, where we started saying, hey, we need to have some standards here. Architectural Barriers Act, fair housing amendments. So yay, things are moving, right? Maybe. And we finally got to the ADA in 1990. Why is that important? Because it's been, 26 years since the ADA was passed? And we're still having issues. The ADA basically covers everything from employment, state and local governments, public accommodations, so all the stores, restaurants, places that you go to, telecommunications, and transportation. The ADAA, and we just call it the ADA, the Amendments Act, so the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act, actually expanded some of the definitions and some of the information that is in the Americans with Disabilities Act. So why did they have to expand it? Well, it's simple. The courts got a hold of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA, when it was first brought out, had very little instructions. Like so little that it actually annoyed people, because we like black and white. We like yes and no. We want to know exactly what we should do. Well, the ADA was designed to allow flexibility and freedom, because there are too many different departments and too many different entities and too many different places. So they couldn't write an act that covered everyone and gave specific information for everything. So they left it general and vague. But again, people didn't like that. So the court started interpreting things. They interpreted it to the point where it's like, well, if you were missing a leg, but you had a prosthetic leg, you're not really disabled, because you got a prosthetic leg, right? Wrong. You're missing a leg, you can still have a disability. Great, you have a mitigating tool at your disposal, but you're still disabled. So that's why the Americans with Disabilities Act amended came into play, because we had to restore the intent behind the Americans with Disabilities Act. All right, so who's covered by the ADA? First, define what is a disability. It's a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. Could be things like walking, talking, hearing, seeing, caring for oneself, you name it. There's a whole list. We could run through it. This is not exhaustive in any way, shape, or form, just to kind of give you some ideas. Could also be somebody who has a record of such impairment. So my wife has breast cancer, had breast cancer. So I actually have some protection on the Americans with Disabilities Act. If I show up for a job and somebody says, I wouldn't hire him. His wife had breast cancer. He's probably going to want to take a lot of time off. Okay, I'm covered there. You don't get to do that to me. Okay? That's pretty fair, I think. It could also be somebody who is regarded as having such an impairment. Okay? It doesn't actually have to be in existence as long as you regard me as having it. So just so you have an idea, Back in 2014, okay, so we're not using current, we're 2014, there were 318.4 million people in the United States. That's according to the Census Bureau. I don't make this stuff up. And according to the U.S. Census Bureau, now I'm going to go back even further, just so that you can't say, well, Chris, you're fudging the numbers. Back in 2010, there were 56.7 million people who had a disability. Let's do the math. Now, the Census Bureau actually says 1 in 5. They round one way. I like to round the other way just to be safe. So let's say 1 in 6. Okay? That way nobody can question my math. Because I know there's some mathematicians in here that were already doing the numbers. And while no one said it yet, I know that someone in here is saying, seriously? 56.7 million people? Are you kidding me? I'm not stupid, Chris. There are not that many people rolling around in wheelchairs. There are not that many people that I see walking down the street who have a disability. So why is that? Well, you tell me. Here's a slide with a lot of different people. There are 4 people on this slide who have a known disability. I want you to take a second and see if you can figure out which of the 4 have a disability. It's a test. All right, I'm joking. You got them? You looked at all the faces? And it's not Peyton Manning, I promise you. It's down there at the bottom. That top person up there, Catherine Zeta-Jones, Academy Award-winning actress. She has a hidden disability known as bipolar disorder. Vince Vaughn, comedian, philanthropist, also has a hidden disability known as dyslexia. Now that third person there, oh, I knew she had a disability, right? Because she has sunglasses and she's got a service animal, so I knew she had a disability. You were right. But what if I told you she was just a fashion-forward animal lover? Would that have changed your opinion? Her disability could be hidden or visible depending on the situation. If I just saw her sitting somewhere, would I know she had a disability? Probably not. If I saw her walking with a cane, maybe. The last person definitely has a visible disability. They're a wheelchair user. So when we say there's 56.7 million people in the United States that have a disability back in 2010, and you say, that's a big number, how come I don't see that many? Well, because the majority of them are hidden. The majority of them are things that you don't see walking down the street. So just because you can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. They still have a disability. Not every disability is visible. So just some quick examples of some things that definitely should be considered as disabilities when you are considering what is a disability. Could be anything from deafness, blindness, cerebral palsy, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, bipolar disorder. I said earlier that a disability limits a major life activity. Can you see where a heart condition would limit a major life activity? If I have a heart condition, do you think I get to run and jog and play with my kids as much? Maybe not. I mean, I'm sure I'll find other ways. But. All right, there are some exclusions from the definition of disability. Things like current illegal use of prescription or other drugs. So, yeah, that doesn't count. Just because I have some effects from illegal drug use, sorry. Compulsive gambling, kleptomania, pyromania are all not considered disabilities. Flat out says in the American Disabilities Act, these don't count. Okay. All right, very quickly, just so that you have some baseline information. 5 titles of the ADA. I know this is so exciting. Title I covers employment. Title II is specifically geared for state and local governments. And I'm going to guess that the majority of you in here are from a state and local government. Oops, sorry. Title III is for private entities, so all your grocery stores, all of your shopping centers, everywhere you go is public. Okay? They have responsibilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act as well. Title IV is about communication. We don't talk about that a whole lot because unless you're into communications, it doesn't really matter. And Title V is just that catch-all. You throw everything in there. But there are some fun stuff in there that specifically addresses Congress, which is interesting. Title I of the ADA specifically addresses all employment practices. We're not going to hit this too hard because we're going to talk about it more later. Recruiting, hiring, promotions, training, pay, everything. Everything from the moment or from how you apply for the job to the company softball team. Again, we'll talk about Title I in a little bit, so I'm not going to dive into this one. This is where we'll save time. Title II is focused on state and local government agencies and prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in their programs, their services, and their activities. What's an activity, a program, a service? Well, it could be everything. Anything you invite the public to come and do, whether it's voting, public education, court systems, Social Security offices, healthcare, maybe you have park systems, everything. When you talk to the public, it's covered under Title II. Okay, it's a program, service, or activity. Again, we'll talk about that more specifically as we go. Title III, again, for our businesses. So some examples of those would be things like sales, service restaurants, theaters, hotels, doctor's offices, child care facilities, you name it. They're all covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and they all have responsibilities, like it or not. The law requires that businesses eliminate eligibility requirements that exclude or segregate individuals with disabilities. Okay? Sometimes that eligibility requirement could just be, can I get in the door? Can I make it through your store with my mobility device? Okay. Or is somebody willing to help me if I can't read the tags? Title III of the ADA. These entities must make reasonable modifications to their policies, practices, and procedures that deny access. So, for example, not allowing animals. Okay? We can have a policy that says no pets. That's no problem. But if it's a service animal, it has to be allowed. We get that question all the time. Well, but a couple of my employees are afraid of dogs. Okay. It still doesn't give you the right to deny access to a true service animal. Because a true service animal is there to help the individual. Okay? We'll talk about service animals in a while. Title IV, not going to get into this one too much. Again, mostly covers communication, things like your telephone systems, your over-the-air broadcast, things like that, saying, hey, they need to be closed captioned, and you need to have provisions to make sure that people with disabilities can hear or see. And again, the miscellaneous provisions. This is where the Access Board has their power. So, and who enforces the ADA? Well, if you're under Title I, it would be the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Okay? If you're talking about employment, the EEOC is the enforcement agency. Pretty much for everything else, it's going to be the Department of Justice. And nobody really likes it when the DOJ comes knocking. That's not fun. All right. So interacting with people with disabilities. You like how fast I'm moving here? I don't hear like lots of applause. I'm going, Chris, you're really doing a great job moving quickly. Yeah, okay, sorry. Let's just give you some general rules to live by. So in most cases, Interactions with anyone who has a disability are nothing more than common sense. I want you to keep that in mind as we keep going. Common sense. The golden rule, that's always a good one. What's the golden rule or the ethic of reciprocity? Well, basically, treat others as you would want to be treated. Okay? No magic bullet, just treat others as you would like to be treated. Relaxing is a good general rule. When you're interacting with people who have disabilities, relax. Don't be uptight. Don't stress over whether you're going to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. Just be yourself. It's the best way to go. But I will say that sometimes, not always, again, we've got lots of different disability types, but sometimes when you're interacting with people with disabilities, it's best to just take your time. Okay? Sometimes a person with a disability may have a harder time expressing themselves. It may take a little longer, and that's fine. It may take them a little longer to move around. I don't know about you guys, but I'm usually in a very fast pace. I'm in a quick mode. When somebody is like slowly going through that door and I want to get to my Big Mac, I'm not a happy person. Relax. Big rule, don't touch. Always ask or warn a person before you touch them. We think we might be helping when we grab somebody by the arm and say, let me show you where you go. No, don't touch. Leave them be. Okay? Don't touch a person's mobility device without asking. That seems like it's pretty much common sense, right? Wrong. Don't grab somebody's wheelchair and try to move it out of the way. If they've left their walker in your path of travel, don't grab it and throw it out of the way. If they've left their cane, just leave it. Okay? And don't touch a person's service dog. I see this one all the time. You go there's the service animal in the store, and everybody wants to stop, and everybody wants to pet the animal, and they would say, it's so cute, it's so sweet, we love that little thing. Leave it alone. It's there to do a job. It's not there for everybody else's enjoyment. Service animals are working animals. Okay? And if you just can't handle it, you just have to touch the cute little animal and pet them behind the ears, ask the owner the handler before you do. All right, it's okay to ask. Ask if a person would like assistance. Don't ever assume they need assistance. Okay, I'll give you a great case in point. Again, I haven't always been with the the Rocky Mountain ADA Center. I used to be a corporate trainer, so my business was making other people sell better. That was my business. Okay? So I had a lot to learn when I came on board. I went to my very first meeting, and there was a person with no arms and no legs. And I was seated next to them in this meeting. And I had no idea how they were going to take notes. It's just how we were going to take notes. You need to take notes. And of course, my instinct was, can I help you? I shouldn't say that. My instinct was, grab the pen and pull the cap off for him and hand it to him. Okay? Because they had this little contraption they used. Never mind. But my point is, they did it all by themselves. It was pretty cool. Okay? By my standards, it was pretty cool. But if I had just acted, that would have been bad. Okay? Always ask before you help somebody. And ask if you're unsure how to interact with them. Okay? If you don't know what to do, just ask. What can I do to help you? How can I help right now? What can I do better? What can I do differently? Okay? Ask. Don't assume. You know what they say about assuming? People first language is very important. Putting the person before the disability. Always put the person before the disability. People first language tells what a person has, not what a person is. Okay? So let's talk about that. Draws attention, or yeah, disability first. I guess what I mean by that is when I say you are a disabled veteran. What does that tell you about the person? It tells you first and foremost that they're disabled. Okay? When what's really important here is that they're a veteran, right? We hear that one all the time. Heck, there's a whole department of the government that's named disabled veterans. It's not right. You're a veteran first, not disabled. You're not a blind person, you're a person who's blind. You're a person before you're a disability. Always put the person first. You can see why. Again, never disabled person, it's always person with a disability. We fight this a lot in the media. They're finally starting to come around. Always person with a disability. Okay? Put the person before the disability, please. That's all I'm going to say about that. Words matter as a whole. Okay? Nobody wants to be referred to as abnormal. Nobody really wants to be referred to as afflicted. You're afflicted. You're afflicted. Who wants to be afflicted? I don't want to be afflicted with nothing. Okay? Not afflicted. Not suffering with. I'm not suffering with anything. You're not wheelchair bound. Hear that one frequently. They're wheelchair bound. Not bound into a wheelchair. There's no ties. It's just how they get around. Don't use words that purposely demean people. Okay? The bottom line is when you start putting words like this out there, it really does make it sound like there's something wrong with being disabled. God forbid we leave here today and one of us in this room is in a car accident. Do you really want to be termed afflicted? Do you want to be wheelchair bound? No, probably not. Is anybody in here today struggling with blue eyes? Thankfully, I'm not. Whew! I don't want to be struggling with my blue eye color. We wouldn't say something like that to somebody. We wouldn't say you're struggling with blue eyes. I'm sorry. Things like hair color, eye color, just a part of who people are. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing different. It's just who they are. Right? This is one of my favorites, handicapped. Love the term handicapped. I'm going to come up here because I have to read this a little closer. So in golf, any golfers in here? Not me, I can't golf at all. At all. Me and the golf course is a bad, bad thing. So a handicap in golf, though, is a numerical measure of a golfer's potential, right? Bottom line is they can't golf as well as everyone else. Maybe they get a handicap. I don't understand the golf as a whole, so bottom line, I just know that in golf we have handicaps, right? Because you're not as good as someone else. Those golfers who didn't raise your hand, you know what I'm talking about. In bowling, you got the same thing. In bowling, you have a handicap because you're not as good as someone else. Because if I was bowling, I don't know what my handicap would be like 280 just to put me on par with everyone else. In sports, you get a handicap when you're not as good as everyone else. I might have gone too far. I've left the range of my clicker. There we go. Handicap implies that you're not as good as everyone else. So quit calling people handicapped. Don't use the H word. Okay? You're disabled. You're not handicapped. person is disabled. They're not handicapped. Okay? I know this was the term for many, many years, and there's still some controversies in the disability communities and what we should do, and you'll see it on parking signs, for goodness sakes. Okay? But somewhere that has to change, because it is offensive to people. Don't use the word handicapped. All right. Common expressions are perfectly fine. Things like, did you hear? See you later. It's all right to say these kind of things. Even if you're talking to somebody blind, it's perfectly fine to say, hey, I'll see you later. When you're talking to things like mobility, disabilities, make sure you speak directly to the person, not over the top of their head. You'll see this one a lot. If you were going to have an in-depth conversation with somebody in a wheelchair, how about we pull up a chair? Okay? To the person in the wheelchair, do they really want to be staring up at you all the time? You ever had to sit in the front row of a movie theater? Kind of stinks. Yeah, you got the movie, just like everybody else. But did you get the same? No. Keep things like ramps and paths clear. See this a lot when you go to 7-Eleven and they right outside, or I don't know if you have 7-Elevens around here because I haven't driven around at all. When you go to the convenience store and they've got the ice machine out front and they got a pallet full of wood and they got some other stuff and it blocks the access, well, fine, I can step around it, but if I'm in a wheelchair, how do I? I don't know. We're going through very quickly, just. When you're interacting with people who have a cognitive or intellectual disability, don't use baby talk. Talk to them like they're adults. Well, would you like to go to the door? You want to go to the store? Does that sound good to you? Did you have a good day today? Did you? No one wants to be talked like that. You talk to me like a baby, I'm probably going to pop you. Knock it off. I'm not a child. Don't treat others that way. Psychiatric disabilities, again, this one is kind of, I'm going to throw it up there just so you guys can see some stuff, but bottom line is you're probably not going to know somebody has a psychiatric disability unless you have an intimate relationship with them. It's generally not the kind of thing that they just walk around going, hey, I'm bipolar. How you doing? I'm Chris, I'm bipolar. Nice to meet you. Okay? You're probably not going to know that unless you have some type of an intimate relationship with them. But if you do, be calm, be supportive, okay? And avoid stereotyping. Remember that things like bipolar, it's just a diagnosis. It's not who they are, okay? It's a diagnosis. Speak directly to a person who is deaf. Ask how they prefer to communicate. Don't shout. And this is one that I definitely want you to, so we're no longer saying, we're no longer going to use handicapped, and we're also not going to use the term hearing impaired. Okay? They're deaf. They're not hearing impaired. I kind of, when I first started at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, one of our staff members is deaf, and I used the term hearing impaired. And about lost his mind on me. Okay? I'm not hearing impaired, I'm deaf. Okay? Don't call me hearing impaired. Sorry. And he explained why. Okay? Again, when you're communicating with somebody who's blind, okay, speak directly to them, not their companions. Make sure you always identify yourself when you enter a conversation and before you make any contact with them. Okay? And if you're giving them information in a written format, it might be a good idea to offer to read it to them or offer an additional or a different format. Okay? I'm not going to get into sight guiding. Most of us will never do that. Biggest thing I can tell you when somebody has a speech disability, maybe they have a big time stutter, I don't know. Be patient. Seriously, just be patient. When it comes to communication, it's one of our rights. And I don't know about you, but I know when I'm at home and I'm fighting with my wife, And usually what will come out of my mouth at some point is, are you not listening to me? Huh? I know somebody in here who's had that same argument with their spouse. Are you not listening to me? We want to be heard, right? We want our voice to be heard. I want to tell you what's going on. I don't want you to finish my sentences. Just tell me what's happening, or let me tell you what's happening. I got it under control. Oh, and gosh, don't pretend you understand if you don't. It's perfectly okay to keep saying, I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Could you write that down? All right. Usually a session like this, and I'm only going to hit this one time, because when we get to the slide later on, I'm not going to cover it again. There are ADA centers across the country. Yours is the Rocky Mountain ADA Center. The Rocky Mountain ADA Center will answer your questions about the Americans with Disabilities Act and, in most cases, related laws. Okay? You got questions, we got answers. A session like this, nobody really wants to ask a question, and even if I gave you time, you weren't going to do it. So that's fine. But if you have questions, contact us. Call us. We'll be glad to answer your questions. You can get us at the Rocky Mountain ADA. I don't like to talk on the phone. I hate to talk on the phone. I don't even like to order Domino's. Right? Now that they have Domino's apps, I'm a happy person because I don't have to talk to anybody, which is fine because you can go to our website and you can ask a question electronically. Just send us the question and we'll send you an answer. Right? That simple. I would ask you guys to do me a favor. I would like you to get up, take a 5-minute break, stretch your legs, come back in here. 5 minutes, because we're going to be starting whether you're here or not, okay? But I don't think you need to get up, so. Let's get this party started, because I know everybody would rather just get through this and be able to leave. All right, remember the Rocky Mountain ADA Center does not provide legal advice. We do provide guidance when it comes to the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's all I have to say about that. Rocky Mountain ADA Center is one of 10 centers nationwide. All have a grant to assist people with understanding and guidance on the Americans with Disabilities Act. All right. We talked about this before. Who's protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act? Anyone who has a substantial limitation to a major life activity. We're not going to cover this too much. All right. Under Title II, so we mentioned that there are 5 titles. Under Title II, that's the one that specifically addresses state and local governments. Okay? All departments, agencies, the special purpose districts, and other instrumentalities of the state or local government. So everything the state does is covered under Title II. Title II applies to all programs, services, or activities. It also applies to contractors and people that you hire outside. Okay? So just because we hire somebody to do something for us doesn't mean it lets us off the hook. We still have an obligation. Okay? Again, not going to cover this too much. Equal treatment, basically, ADA is all about civil rights. These are just the basic principles of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title II talks about policies, procedures, and practices. The things that the state or local government does and how they need to be accessible to people with disabilities. When we look at things like policies and procedures that state and local governments have, many of them are routine policies and practices. They're not meant to exclude people. I don't truly believe that most people set out to discriminate, but that's not always what truly happens. Okay? Because a lot of times you get the frontline employee that says, but these are the rules. And they forget that sometimes we need to change the rules. So maybe at the Department of Motor Vehicles, the procedure is I arrive, I get a ticket, and I stand in a very long line. Okay? What if I'm a person who uses crutches? Is that appropriate to make me stand in a very long line on my crutches? Maybe not. Maybe we could modify that policy to allow me to have a seat and not lose my place in line. The Americans with Disabilities Act does not say that you need to give anybody any special treatment, so they don't have to be moved to the front of the line. They just don't lose their place in line. That's fair, right? What if we had things like again, no animals policy? Could we allow a service animal? Sure. What if we had a building, say a county building, and no food or drink inside the building, but I have diabetes and I need to control my blood sugar levels, so I usually have a small snack with me. Would it be okay for me to bring in my small snack? Provided I clean up my own mess and I don't make one. Okay? That's all common sense. And here in this room, we sit here and go, of course that'd be fine, Chris. That'd be no problem. Sure. Why wouldn't we? Of course. Problem with this, that's not what always happens. A lot of times we get the person that says, no, the rule says no food or drink. Get out. And then we get into trouble. Okay? That's why the Americans with Disabilities Act was purposely left open and vague, because they couldn't address every single policy and procedure that was out there. They needed people to use their common sense, to take a common sense approach, and make reasonable modifications where necessary. So again, some examples there. Oh, yeah, maybe we have a test that somebody has to take. It's only provided to them in a written format. But the person has dyslexia. Would it be okay to provide that same test in an audio format? Sure. It's the same test. Still scored the same. All right. Reasonable modifications. So when we have policies in place, we have to make sure that they can be modified to accommodate people who have disabilities. Just bottom line. And typically speaking, those modifications are just common sense approaches, nothing more. The key word, though, when we say a reasonable accommodation, that's the fancy term for make a common sense choice, is reasonable. Again, it's not reasonable to believe that because I use crutches, that I get to move to the front of the line. Why? Nobody else does. It's not reasonable. It's not reasonable for me to believe that because I have a mobility disability, that I get to get carried in to the building by 6 strapping young lads on a carpet of gold. That is not reasonable. Okay? We only consider reasonable accommodations. All right, another key element of Title II would be communication. Communication is huge. Under Title II, if you deal with the public, you have a responsibility to provide communication. You provide it for everyone else. It's an essential part of dealing with the public. Okay? The ADA requires that public entities take steps to communicate effectively with people who have disabilities. Now, in the ADA, they use this fancy term called auxiliary aids and services. And they say Title II entities, state and local governments are required to provide auxiliary aids and services. Okay. What the heck is an auxiliary aid or service? It's not really that fancy. It's just anything that lets people communicate. That. Could be things like an interpreter, video remote interpreting, something that's printed in large print, not just the standard fonts, things that are provided in an electronic format so that I may not be able to read it now, but I can go home and read it on my computer with my screen reader. Could be any number of things. And again, the Americans with Disabilities Act just had to put a fancy term on tools. Tools that help people communicate. That's it. So auxiliary aids and services are nothing more than tools that help people communicate. How do you figure out which tool to use, or auxiliary aid or service? Well, you always want to consider the nature and the length of the communication. Always consider the complexity of the communication. So a person who is deaf may only need to exchange notes in order to pay a parking ticket. Okay. Do we have to get all fancy? Oh wait, you're deaf. One moment, I will call an interpreter. It will be 3 to 5 days before I can answer your questions. Okay, probably not needed. Why don't we just write some notes? Okay, pretty simple. A person who is deaf attending a town hall meeting, on the other hand, do you think exchanging notes is going to be the most effective form of communication? Probably not. I'm doubting that trying to jot notes back and forth is probably not going to be the best. So that's where we start coming into things like cart services, where we have somebody who actually is putting the spoken word onto a screen that everybody can read. Okay? I don't know about you guys, but when I go to some big graduation ceremony somewhere or whatever, I'm not deaf, but I sure like those cart services because I can never understand what they're saying. Okay? Could be just a sign language interpreter. Okay? We just have to look at how in-depth this conversation is going to be. So you got a little pamphlet that shows you how to get a hunting license. Okay? Pretty straightforward, but again, I'm blind. How do you effectively communicate with me? You going to hand me the pamphlet? Here you go, sir. Probably not. Doesn't really do me a whole lot of good, now does it? But it's short, it's to the point. Could you just hit the highlights with me? Just, here's the pamphlet, let me tell you what it's in it. Okay? That would be great. But if you were giving me a, emergency management plan for evacuating the entire city, you're going to try to read that to me? No. You're probably going to provide that to me in an electronic format. Okay? Something that I can go home and read on my screen reader on my own. So again, how do you figure out which one to use? Evaluate the nature and length of the communication, the complexity of it, and then another big way, ask. If you don't know, ask. How best can we help you? All right, we're going to cover about communication in a little while, so we aren't going to hit that one too much more. But again, programs. We already know that public entities have an obligation to make sure that their services programs are all available to people with disabilities, right? You got that? Okay, so what is a program? This is a very difficult one to answer for you and is straightforward. So I'm just going to give you some examples. How you go about getting a hunting license. That would be a program, activity, or service. If you were having an art expo, would be a program, a service, or activity. You're inviting people to come check out this art. Do we need to provide that same accessibility? Yeah. Childcare, job vote postings, voting, museums, sports teams. Anything you invite the public to participate in would be considered a program, service, or activity. All right. Public entities have an ongoing obligation to ensure that individuals with disabilities are not excluded from programs and services. Typically speaking, when we talk about that, people think it's about getting inside the building, right? Hey, don't worry, man. Our building's all ADA compliant. Right, but you've got all the art on display. How does somebody who is blind have any idea what it is? Is that fair to them? They may not be able to take in the beauty and the majesty of the artist's individual brush strokes and stuff. But then again, I don't either. I just look at it and go, cool. Looks nice. But we do want to make sure that they have the ability to partake in the same event. Okay. So again, talking about people always thinking that it's all about the structural changes. All right, so I'm going to we'll address this a little bit. Okay, I hate the structural part of things. This is not my area of expertise, but I will talk about it because you do have an obligation to make sure that things are structurally able to get into physically. I think we'll talk about it in a second. Keep in mind that many of your services, programs, things like that are available online only. So you have to make sure that your websites are accessible. There we go, facility access, the structural changes. So keep in mind that when we talk about structural changes, they're not required where other solutions are feasible. So, give you an example. The offices that need to be accessed are on the second floor. The only way up there is a set of stairs. Okay? Do I have to put in an elevator? No. Could I move the offices downstairs? Yeah. Okay? If I can't move the offices downstairs, are there other alternatives? Yeah. Maybe I just provide the service downstairs, not the whole office. But there's some caveats with that, and we'll talk about them in a bit. Bottom line is, there's no law that says you have to make every building, everything, accessible structurally. Okay? It just says you got to be able to access the services. If you are going to make structural changes, you darn well better make sure that they meet the ADA standards for accessible design, unless it's technically infeasible to not do it or to do it. So, give you a quick example of kind of what this means. Bottom line, let's say that I needed to put into a ramp in order for people to access this door, right? But I can only make the ramp so long because there's a part of the building right here. Normally I step up, I walk right up to the door, but now I got to put a ramp coming out. I don't understand the whole physics of the thing. Bottom line is I don't have enough room to put the ramp the ADA says I should. It's not going to be long enough. Okay? Can I alter the ramp a little bit? Yep. As long as it's still safe. Because I've seen those ramps where it's a death trap. If you tried to roll out of that building, you will die. Okay? It's just not a good idea. Nor could you ever get up it. Okay? Just because I put a ramp there doesn't mean that it's actually functional. So yes, we want to make sure that we follow the ADA standards. There are some provisions that allow us to make some modifications as long as it doesn't, not going to injure anybody, okay? A significant safety risk. Public entities are not required to make changes to historic buildings. Okay? But that doesn't change the fact that you have an obligation to make sure that the program or service offered inside the historic building is accessible. So I'm just thinking, we've got this Rockledge Ranch out in Colorado Springs, and it's just this great little place that we can go with our family. It's like a working ranch from back in the 1800s, and they got the original buildings, and they haven't modified them, and that's great. But if I use a mobility device, in the 1800s, they were tiny people, and their doorways were about this big. Okay? I can't get through them now. So a person with a mobility device is never getting through there. Do they just never get to experience what it was like in the 1800s inside of a home? No. We need to provide them with something else. Maybe it's a video tour. I don't know. Maybe it's you're not off the hook just because you can't let somebody into that historic property. Entities are not required to take any actions that would incur an undue burden or undue financial burden. Okay? Sometimes the budget's just not there. Sometimes paying $250,000 to put in an elevator into a building that's not very much used is just not good financial resource or use of our financial resources. But I do want to make sure that we understand that if we are using the undue financial burden excuse, I won't say excuse, forget what I'm going to say. Just bottom line is, if you're going to use it, you got to make sure that it is a department head or above who makes that decision. Okay? And that department head better have some financial input. They better have some input on how the budget is spent. Then they better write something down now, not later, that says why they're not going to do it. Okay? So yeah, you don't have to do it, but you better make sure that you are following the right steps. Again, financial constraints. Not everybody has an unlimited budget. So you can't necessarily run around and make everything that you want to make accessible right here, right now, today. Let's assume that we had 5 swimming pools in the city, 5 public swimming pools. And we have budget to make sure that one of them gets brought up to standards and is accessible to everyone. Okay? We can't do all of them. So how do we determine which one gets done? Well, we're going to look at things like geographic distribution. We're going to look at transit, how people get to it, what are the hours, what classes are offered there, what services. All of these things would factor in. It's not just, well, that's the closest one to my house, and I didn't want to have to drive, so I just picked that one. Okay? Does that make sense? Sometimes you have to make decisions based on finances, and the Americans with Disabilities Act gets that. They understand that. But you better make sure that your decisions are based in fact, not just objectives. That's totally the wrong word, but that's okay. I think you understand what I meant. Keep in mind that Title II entities have an ongoing obligation to keep things going. We can hit each of these if you want, but I think you'd rather just me summarize it by saying just because you got things up to speed once doesn't mean that you're done. When you are working and you are trying to make things accessible, you have an ongoing obligation to make sure that things stay accessible. Okay? That's the summary. My least favorite subject in the entire world. If I haven't put you to sleep yet, I will now. The 2010 standards for accessible design. Lord have mercy, help me. This is the Bible, how things are built. Okay? Do you really care how it got here? Probably not. But in 1991, there was the ADAG. It got modified to the 2010 standards. It became enforceable in 2012. So we've been working on this one for a little while. Okay? Bottom line is all new constructions and alterations as of March 15th in 2012 have to comply with 2010 standards for accessible design. Okay? So what does the 2010 standards for accessible design cover? Everything. That's not true. It doesn't cover everything. But it does cover everything from parking to the routes from the parking to the door, reach ranges, how far I have to reach up to grab something, how high something can be up on the wall or on different areas. Protruding objects, things that stick out of the walls, ramps, ATM machines, vending machines, you name it. Everything seems to be covered under the 2010 standards. Aren't you so happy that I am not going to sit here and tell you how wide the doorways have to be? I just want you to note, though, because we said that went into effect back on March 15th, 2012, right? Okay. There are no grandfather clauses with the Americans with Disabilities Act. We hear that one a lot. Well, this is grandfathered in. No, it's not. There's no such thing as a grandfather clause. But there is something called safe harbor. And safe harbor basically states that if you were in compliance with the 1991 standards, back in 2000, let's say March 14th of 2012, so the day before this went into effect, you were completely in compliance. No problems, no issues, okay? Then when the 2010 standards came out, you didn't have to run and make them all change. Okay? And there were some changes. You were not grandfathered. I almost said it. You had safe harbor. That as long as you don't disrupt anything, you can live in safe harbor infinitely. But safe harbor only exists until things start changing. Okay? Once you decide to start changing things, safe harbor goes away, and you are now expected to comply with 2010 standards across the board. So let's assume for a second that this room right here complied with 1991 standards on March 14th, and we haven't touched it since. Okay? But then Chris decides he's going to replace the carpeting. Okay? Carpeting is a covered element of the 2010 standards. So once it's flooring. Okay? Once I change the carpeting, now I've triggered a whole bunch of other things that I have to worry about. I have to worry about getting into the building, and I have to worry about the reach ranges and the operable parts of things. And left alone, it was okay. That's my quick summary of 2010 standards for accessible design. There are some areas of the 2010 standards that are not eligible for safe harbor. Why aren't they eligible for safe harbor, Chris? Well, that's easy. They weren't covered before. They weren't ever addressed in the 1991 standards, so they couldn't possibly be covered under safe harbor because you never had them accessible. Things like golf facilities. What? Amusement rides were never covered before, but now they are. There were some residential standards that weren't covered before, now they are. Shooting ranges, saunas, miniature golf courses, playgrounds. That was probably one of the big ones. Play areas for kids. Okay? There are standards under the 2010 standards that state what should happen in a playground. How do you make it accessible? Okay? Ticketing is covered under the under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm done talking about 2010 standards. That's the extent of my. The biggest thing I'll point out when it comes to ticketing is that we want to make sure that there are no surcharges. If you have an event and you are giving tickets, you do not get to charge more to somebody who is disabled than somebody who is not. You cannot raise the prices. Okay? There are also standards that say how many and where the accessible seating should be. Okay? Covers things like companions. There should be policies in place that cover things like how many tickets can I buy? I know when I go to the Broncos games in Denver, the accessible seating is much cooler than my nosebleed seat. And I don't get to go often, but occasionally. And when I do, it's only in the nosebleed area. So why couldn't somebody just buy a whole bunch of tickets in the accessible seating area? Because there's policies about it. Okay? And you should definitely have them. All of these things should be covered under a policy. We're not going to hit them all, but See how I'm doing here? Doing too bad. We mentioned it before. Contractors are definitely covered under Title II. You don't get to give away responsibility. You can give away the job and have somebody else do it, but you don't give away the responsibility under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if that contractor is hiring people illegally, if they're not following standard procedures, if they're not doing what they should be doing, you are liable. Okay. I like it when it just skips really fast. All right. There are some what we call administrative responsibilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I know you guys are excited about this one. You've always wanted to know what your administrative responsibilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act are. Well, I'm going to tell you. So the responsibilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act is that every state and local government agency with 50 or more people should name an ADA coordinator. It doesn't have to have that title, ADA coordinator, but every agency with 50 or more employees should have an ADA coordinator, someone who coordinates that department's efforts in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And don't tell me if your department doesn't. I don't want to know. Don't care, to be really honest with you, because I don't have a badge. But this is what the Americans with Disabilities Act says. You need to have somebody who's there to help coordinate all the efforts of the government agency. Okay? The ADA coordinator is responsible for the efforts of the entity. They are also responsible for investigating any complaints that come in as far as discrimination is concerned. Okay? It happens. It happens all too often. The complaints come, but that does not necessarily mean that they're legit. And that's where the coordinator steps in. Okay? When it comes to an ADA coordinator, this should not be a secret. Okay? It should not be something that is just, hush, don't tell anybody who I am. This should be public. This should be out there. The name of the person, their office, their telephone number, their address, and the ADA doesn't specifically state it, but I'm going to guess nowadays the email address of the ADA coordinator should be public knowledge. That's important, guys. In some of my other classes, I will say, all right, everybody's got a smartphone, and I'm not going to make you do this right now, but I'll say, all right, give you 5 minutes. Let's see if you can come up with who is the ADA coordinator for Lufkin, Texas. And we're talking some, brilliant, educated people that can't figure it out. Why? Because it's not public. Unless you find the right PDF document buried in the back of something somewhere that's 48 pages long, and at the very bottom last sentence it says, this is who the ADA coordinator is. Or at least who it was like 2 years ago. Why should that information be public? Well, first off, if I don't know who to complain to locally, who am I going to complain to? Do you remember who the enforcement agencies are? I'm going directly to the EEOC, or I'm going directly to the DOJ, Department of Justice. Okay? Those are my alternatives. When somebody calls the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and says, I have a potential complaint, I have a problem, I don't take the complaint, but here's what I can tell you to do. Let's see if we can stay as local as possible. And I'll look and do the research and see if I can figure out who they should be talking to. And if I can't figure it out, then I go, well, I guess your only other alternative is to file a complaint with the Department of Justice. Okay, that's not fun. Nobody likes that. All right, we're not going to cover that. Don't care. Moving right along. Public notice. Every entity is required to have public notice that they are and will try to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Doesn't matter how big or small the entity, so even if they are less than 50 people, don't have their own ADA coordinator, they should still have a policy in place that says we do not discriminate. Really? There we go. Again, this should be a public notice. This isn't a private notice. This isn't something that's just kind of pinned to the bathroom wall. This is something that's out there on display, usually on bulletin boards, on websites, on things like that. Hey, click here if you want to know our policy on. Okay. Okay, now that we've got an ADA coordinator, we've established a policy that says, hey, we don't discriminate against people. We now want to have a grievance procedure. Okay? We've got somebody you can complain to or talk to, but how do you actually go through the process? Because sometimes people have unrealistic expectations. They believe, I lodged a complaint last week. It's been 48 hours, and I don't see anything happening. Right? Can you see that happening? Yeah, people are like that sometimes. So we want to tell them, this is how the process works. We'll get it, we'll review it, we'll do it, whatever. However the process is going to work. And then we also want to tell them that if they don't like our response from the ADA coordinator, this is how they would appeal it. Okay? Administrative responsibilities continued. So we've got a coordinator, we've got a grievance procedure, we've got public notice that says we don't discriminate against people. Now it's time for us to actually start looking at our facilities and all the places that we have and determining whether they are accessible. Are the doorways wide enough? Are the doors, the ramps the right, and are there? This is called a self-evaluation. Okay? We'd also want to look at our policies and our procedures. Do we have the policies that we need? And if we don't, are we going to get them? Because there's a lot of policies that you should have in place. Once we're done with that, we can document everything that we find. What this is a self-evaluation. It's described under the ADA. It specifically tells state and local governments to go out and create a snapshot of your current environment and tell us what you've done right and what you still need to fix. Okay? A snapshot, self-evaluation. And then take that snapshot, self-evaluation, and turn it into a transition plan. How are you going to fix it? As we talked about earlier, we pointed out specifically, there's not always the money to fix things immediately. Man, it'd be great if we just got a big blank check that just said, fine, and we hired all the contractors and we made it happen in one fiscal year. Not going to happen. So we have to have a plan on how we're going to make things accessible over time. That's called a transition plan. For a lot of entities, that transition plan is printed in a binder and it's gathering dust in the back of somebody's bookshelf. That's not what the DOJ envisioned or envisions. The Department of Justice envisions something that is living and breathing and constantly changing and being modified, because that's the real world that we live in. Things change. Things get modified. And we need to be able to keep up. All right, I promised you more about communication. 10:30. I think we're supposed to wrap. Okay. So I promised you a little bit more about communication. Again, just some key points. Companions are included when we talk about a Title II's responsibility to provide effective communication. Okay, so if I am here to get a driver's license, but I am 16 and I am with my mom who is deaf, you need to be able to communicate with mom just as effectively as you communicate with the person getting the driver's license. Okay? Again, family members, friends, associates, people that are with me, you have that same obligation to provide effective communication to everyone. We talked about things like a graduation ceremony. Okay? Yeah. If you're hosting a big thing and you've got everybody in this big room and you're doing this big graduation ceremony, good chance somebody in there is not going to be able to hear. So we need to have effective communication, and maybe we provided cart services or a translator. We talked about auxiliary aids and services. Again, not going to hit this one too much because, again, the bottom line is simply an auxiliary aid and service is just a tool, whatever tool it takes to get the job done, right? Okay, we can all agree to that? All right, we'll move on. Talked about it depends. We get far more in depth. If we really want to break this down again, we're trying to figure out which auxiliary aid or tool to use. We would identify the situation that we're dealing with, look at the situation from all angles. So again, if it was just something like a meetings, what difficulties would different disability types face, and then see if we can come up with the appropriate measures to help. Again, in a lot of cases, ask is the best solution. What you need. Okay? When it comes to communication, I'm not sure if I hit this later, so I'm going to say it now. When it comes to communication, typically the person with the disabilities' opinion on what they need is what counts the most. Okay? You might think that all we need is, all we need is an interpreter. They go, no, I need this. I need large print. I need whatever. That's what matters. Their opinion is what matters. Okay? Unless you can absolutely show that your way is better. It's a defense. That's really all that is. All right. There we go. Public entities are required to give primary consideration to the type of auxiliary aid or service requested by the person with a disability unless they can demonstrate that another equally effective means of communication is available, unless the requested aid or service would fundamentally alter the nature of the program, service, or activity. So, just a totally ludicrous example, but let's assume that what I need is somebody that will communicate to me very loud with a megaphone. Okay? This is what I need in order to be able to be heard. And you go, that's nice, but it's story time at the library, Chris. That ain't gonna work. Because we ain't blasting no megaphone here in the library. That's going to fundamentally alter the nature of a library as a whole, as a quiet place to reflect and learn. Okay, unless the requested aid or service would create an undue burden. Again, what I need are 6 strapping young lads to carry me into the building and that's not going to happen, Chris, because we don't have finances or resources for that kind of nonsense. Hi. Again, just keep in mind when it comes to saying something creates an undue financial burden, always made by a director or above who has input when it comes to how the budget is truly spent. Okay? If you don't have any input on how the budget's spent, don't make the decision. All right, we talked about just generalized. I want to talk a little bit about what is a qualified sign language interpreter. Okay? Qualified sign language interpreters are people that are able to interpret effectively. They have to be able to interpret impartially. They have to be able to interpret receptively, so back and forth. Okay? They have to be able to interpret using all necessary specialized vocabulary and able to maintain confidentiality. So Chris knows a little bit of sign language. Okay? And when I say a little bit, I truly mean a little bit. But let's say I knew a lot. I'm pretty fluent. Okay. But does that mean that I can go into a doctor's office and sit and interpret for somebody who's getting a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer? And the treatment plan that they're going to be going over and the medications that they're going to be on? No, I don't. I don't have the specialized vocabulary. I don't have an English vocabulary that is specialized enough to help me understand what doctors are telling me half the time. When we use a sign language interpreter, they have to have the necessary language to communicate. Okay? What's the language in a legal setting is very different than the language in medical settings. It's very different than the one in psychology, and you get it. You get my point. Okay? Not all interpreters are qualified, and not all interpreters are qualified for all situations. Just because you sign doesn't make you an interpreter. Okay? You are a user, but you're not an interpreter. So who chooses and who pays for the interpreter? No one in government likes this slide. Bottom line is, you do. The covered entity always pays for an interpreter, not the person. The person never pays for an interpreter. I am not deaf, so when I show up and I want to partake in a service that you offer, I don't have to pay anything extra, right? I just get to partake in the service, even if it is I'm paying my parking ticket or I am at court. Hopefully it doesn't happen too often. Why should somebody else have to pay more because of an interpreter? They don't, you do. Okay? But the covered entity typically chooses who the interpreter is. So there's nothing that says you can't work out a contract with a local interpreting company or service, and yeah, no problems there. Okay? As long as the interpreter can provide effective communication, it's all good. And you're not putting any surcharges on the person. Okay? I do want to point out that minor children should never be used as an interpreter except in emergency situations that involve direct threat. Okay? Friends and family should never be used as interpreters, except in emergency situations, okay, involving imminent threat. Okay? Unless the person who is deaf specifically requests it. You can't force somebody to use the interpreter of your choice. If they have something that they would rather do, that's perfectly fine. Okay? As long as they specifically are requesting it, not you're goading them into requesting it. You sure you wouldn't want your mom to just interpret for you? Are you sure? You sure? It'd be a lot faster. Okay? So why no kids? Why no friends? Why no family? Well, it should be fairly obvious. They're not impartial. They may have contrary interests. Okay? They may not be able to keep it confidential, which is part of being a qualified sign language interpreter, is that you keep it confidential. And let's face facts, they may not be all that accurate. Okay. I want to hit this one real quick because this is becoming very, very popular, especially in areas where sign language interpreters are at a premium. And I know some of the states we deal with, there's like 2 sign language interpreters in an entire state. Okay. So VRI, video remote interpreting, is becoming extremely popular. VRI is great. It allows a person to utilize an interpreter when they need it, where they need it, and for as long as they need it. Okay? It's very simple to use. It can be done on a smartphone. It can be done with a tablet. It can be done on a computer. There are a variety of different ways to go about it. There are some performance standards. If you're going to use VRI, you need to make sure that your audio, your video does not lag in any way, shape, or form, so that the images cannot be choppy, grainy, or blurry. If they are, it's not effective communication. Shut it off and just go about another way of doing business. Okay? Find an actual interpreter if that's the case. Images must be sharply delineated and large enough to display the interpreter's face, arms, and hands, fingers, and the participating person's face, arms, hands, and fingers. Why? Because sign language doesn't take place from here to here. Okay? FaceTime is nice, but sign language takes all of this. Okay? And I've got to be able to see all of this in order to effectively communicate using American Sign Language. Okay? The other part of this technology is that the person who's actually utilizing it needs to be able to set it up quickly. Because if you are calling the manager and let me call our IT, I'm not sure. Okay, give me a couple minutes and that's not effective communication. It needs to be quick, clear, concise, and to the point. Okay? So, again, VRI is not going to work in every situation. I shouldn't say again. It will be effective in a lot of situations, okay? Because VRI, again, just allows you to contact an interpreter through the internet. You've got one on call. I know there's like a company above where my wife works that's their job. That's what they do. They provide VRI services all the time. I think they're there 24 hours a day. Right? The bottom line with VRI is that it must result in effective communication. All right, computer-aided real-time transcription services. That's the stuff where, again, we might have a person sitting over here to the side that is typing everything I say and putting it up onto that screen. Computer kind of helps them to keep up, because some people talk really, really fast and some people talk really, really slow. The bad thing with CART services is it's great because it puts it up all on their screen, right? Okay, but what if you don't read that fast? I know sometimes when I'm watching those kind of things, and we've all done it, okay, you look away and you look back and now you don't know where you're at, okay, because it keeps changing all the time. You got to have very fast English reading skills. So it may not be right for somebody who has a cognitive disability. Okay? If English was not my first language, it may not be the right solution. Alternate formats. Things we talk about alternate formats a lot of times: Braille, electronic documents for screen readers, audio recordings, magnification software and devices, transcribers. There's no magic when it comes to these. There's nothing that says you need to have every document available in Braille. Okay? Every document that you hand to the public has to be in Braille. No. Okay? But what we do say is that if somebody requests a document in Braille, you need to be able to get it to them in a reasonable time frame. So if you can't, I've requested it on Friday, but you're not going to put the request in until next Thursday, and then it's got to go to the printer, and then it's going to be 2 to 3 weeks, and then that's probably not the best. You need to find a way to get it done a little faster. Okay? But does it have to be on demand? Maybe not. But electronic documents, on the other hand, that's a different story, because almost every document can be made, and if it's made correctly the first time, can be produced electronically simply. Every one of us probably uses Word at some point in time, and you have that little button up there that says convert to a PDF document. If you've created your Word document correctly, your PDF document will be good to go. In case you need it, large print, 18 points or bigger. You want to avoid a few things like italics. Don't print over the top of images. That's bad. Don't use glossy paper. Okay. I am not going to sit here and bore you with this kind of stuff, but it is kind of interesting to know when it comes to websites. I can tell you the vast majority of websites are not accessible. Okay? You'd think they would be, but they're not. Why? Because they do things like that picture that I see as a skull in danger is actually just called image. So to a person with a screen reader trying to look over my website, just sees image. Image of what? Doesn't care, Chris. Just image. That's all you need to know. They don't properly alt tag. Okay? Alt tag just tells the reader or tells a person in a written format what that picture is. So this is instead of image of George Washington at Valley Forge. Okay? Image of George Washington and Lafayette at Valley Forge. That's all it really takes. Just tell me what the image is, in most cases. We'll cover that more. CAPTCHA, everybody love those things at the end, where you have to try to figure out what that word is. You're seeing those go away, thankfully. Why? Because they're completely inaccessible. I can never figure out what those things are half the time. I hit that little refresh button, and I keep looking for one that makes sense to me. Okay? How does a person utilizing a screen reader figure it out? Because you can't put it as an alt tag and say, this says, Urythema. Okay? You can't say it because then the computer would, or the hacker would be able to figure it out, or the bot would be able to figure it out. So people are moving, or a lot of web is moving towards, good Lord, towards logic-based questions, okay, which can make a little more sense. Again, don't want to bore you with all these things. Captioning for videos is very, very, very important. I won't play this video, largely because I said there were no videos on my presentation, but then I lied. Okay. Got any idea what this video is all about? Yeah, me neither. Without captioning, this is nothing. How many times you've been to an airport restaurant and you find a few minutes to sit down at the airport waiting between flights, and you're at the sports bar part and you're looking up at the screen and there's no captioning and you have no idea what's being said and what's going on. Okay? But when they have captioning on, whew, thank goodness. Do want to point out that if you have anything to do with websites, if you have anything to do with videos, be careful about automated companies that provide captioning. Okay? Just make sure you review them before you actually release it, because they're not always that accurate. Okay? If you're going to provide things in an audio format, make sure they're in written as well. You can kind of see, like back on this screen, what are you supposed to do? Nothing, we don't know. But if I go here, then I can say, okay, click anywhere to get started. Typically, websites, you want to have this little button up at the top that allows you to change the font to make it larger if necessary. So this is directly from the Job Accommodations Network website. Click the little button. All the text get bigger, not all the pictures. Doesn't just make everything on the screen bigger, just makes the text bigger, easier to read. All websites should pretty much have that. Color, this is good just across the board for anything you do. If you're providing information in simply color, don't, because people who are colorblind can't see it. If I say, click on the red box, okay, which one's red? Okay. When you're using documents, websites, doesn't matter. Things you want to avoid, again, red, green. Okay. Orange is great for a quick little look at me thing, but if you're trying to type in orange, bad. You want to avoid things that are too vivid or too bold. I don't know about you, but that's very 1980s. Too much texture is great. You don't see this as much anymore, but remember when websites first started coming out and everybody would have these crazy, the third one down there, Celtic background with words over the top. What does that say? I'm this close and I can barely read it. Okay. You want to watch your contrasts. Good Lord. Keep columns if you're going to have tables. If you're going to have tables in your websites or your documents, make sure that they're just kind of clean and neat. When you start getting into multiple different columns, why? Because screen readers read it linearly. It's going to tell you what each column says, and when you start talking about too many rows and columns, it starts getting very convoluted. I'm skipping. Need to make sure that all of your commands are available through a keyboard. Flashing objects, don't have them. Or keep them to 3 per second. what this is. No, don't have pop-up blocker or pop-ups. Oh my God, nobody likes those to begin with. Can you imagine using a screen reader and you think you're doing great and everything's wonderful and all of a sudden you just stops talking to you because a pop-up popped up and you don't know what the heck is going on your screen? Yeah, don't do that. Again, I'm not getting into all these. Unless you want to get into web design, we can do that later. I will say this though, okay? Websites are great. What we typically see more, or what we would want to focus on more, are things that we use on a regular basis, would be like Word documents, okay? When it comes to a Word document, we definitely want to make sure that they are accessible. I told you before that if I create a document in Word that is accessible, when I convert it to a PDF, it will be able to easily be read by a screen reader. Okay? How do I do that? Well, at the top of Word, you've got that cute little toolbar up there. I don't think I can make a, can I? Oh yeah, cute little toolbar up there. And it tells you things like heading, or title, or body. Select the right one. Don't do everything as a title. Don't do everything as body and just make the font bigger. Okay? Tell it what you're doing. So that's a title, that's a heading, and all that in the middle there, that's a body. Click the right one, it'll automatically translate. Screen reader reads it beautifully. Gives you a little closer up there. If you're going to drop a hyperlink into a document or an email, don't just drop the copy, paste, right? Because to a screen reader says, hyperlink. Hyperlink to what? I mean, is this a hyperlink to the college or university that I'm wanting to check out? Or is this a hyperlink to to a porn site? I mean, I don't know. Okay? How do I go about really putting one in here? It's easy. If you go up to the top and you hit insert, okay, it'll come up with this cute little insert what? And that's when we can simply tell it, I'm sorry, I think you right click on. Yeah, place your cursor where you want the hyperlink to be, on the insert tab in the link, blah, 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 blah. Anyways, I'm going to type here what the hyperlink should be. So this is a link to the Rocky Mountain ADA Center. Here's the actual hyperlink, and that's where I can paste it. And then when I click OK, it comes up with this. And the screen reader says, hyperlink, Rocky Mountain ADA Center. And I say, yay. Avoid using repeated or blank characters. Theirs are bad. When you are creating a cell, don't use these little, you just kind of collapse the cell because it looks good. Don't do that. Because the screen reader says, blank cell. And you do that too many times and a person just assumes that we're done. It's a blank cell. I can click off now. Just like on a website, if you're going to drop little pictures into your documents, you better tell me what they are. Okay? You need to tag this and tell me what it is. So if you've got this image of a star, you need to tell me it's an image of a star. Image of a person laughing. This is a table that predicts the voting of Democrats and Republicans in the blah, blah, blah election. How do I do that? I right-click on the image. I go down to Format Picture. I click on Alt Text up there. Where is it? There we go. And then I type in what it is. So this is like a laughing emoji. I didn't put anything in the title, no problem. Just tell me what it is. So now when I hover over it, I go backwards. Oh, sorry. When I hover over it, it actually pops up and says a laughing emoji, and that's how a screen reader would read it. So it's going to read all your text, and it's also going to say, here's what the picture is. Okay, not just image. All right, don't use floating pictures in Word documents. Floating mean I can just kind of scroll around it, and it just makes the words kind of conform around it. Sorry, I know that just looks better sometimes. It doesn't work. Floating images are bad. You have to fix them. You have to put them in a logical order. Okay? I'm not going to show you how to do that. Avoid watermarks unless you're going to specifically tell me what the watermark is. Screen readers don't read watermarks. All right, if you didn't catch anything that I just said, that's perfectly fine, and you used Word documents, no problem. Here we go. Here's your magic fix-all for everything, almost. Check it before you finish. If you click on File, right there, click on it. Then click on Inspect Document, okay? And check for accessibility issues. It will come back and tell you everything you've done wrong. So I've got repeated blank characters. That's really all I did wrong on that one. Go fix them, okay? Before you send it out, check it. Can't remember now. All right, we're going to hit this one because it's important. Service animals. This is one of the biggest subjects that people hate. Hate to love. Depends on who you are. Service animals brings up a lot of controversy, a lot of questions. I would truly tell you that probably 80% of the phone calls that we get at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center are concerning service animals. Keep in mind that 97% of all statistics are made up on the spot, but 80% of the phone calls that we get are probably about service animals. The ADA is very, very clear about service animals. A service animal is a dog that is individually trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability, including a physical, sensory, psychiatric, intellectual, or other mental disability. There are some provisions for miniature horses. I'm not going to get into that right now, but bottom line is that there's not a law that says miniature horses, but there are some provisions that the Americans with Disabilities Act can see that some people are allergic to dogs. So how could I have one as a service animal? Not to mention that horses live longer. Okay. All right, under the ADA, comfort, therapy, or emotional support animals have they get nothing. Why? Because they're not specifically trained to do a task. Okay? So comfort, emotional therapy animals have no protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act because they are not trained to do a specific task. But Chris, they calm me down. No, you reach for them to calm yourselves down. Okay? They don't do nothing. They exist. They do their dogly duty. Okay? That's their job. Now, can an animal be trained to sense when my heart rate is accelerated, when I have reached an agitation level, whatever? Can then that dog now come to me and do something that helps to ground me? Maybe helps remind me that, hey, it's okay, you're in this space, it's all right, okay? That's a task, because they've been trained to sense something and do something about it. But just existing as an emotional support or a therapy animal does not give them any protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act. All right, service animals must be allowed in all areas. This is just an absolute. They are allowed in all areas that the public is allowed into. You don't get to pick and choose where service animals go. So just because somebody might have an allergy against dogs or they're scared of animals, it's not a right to refuse somebody access, okay? You can't. Small provision, where it would fundamentally alter the nature of the service program or activity. So let's assume for a second that I have a a wolf exhibit at my local zoo. Okay? And dogs are kind of a prey of wolves, especially the small dogs. And when I bring a dog into the wolf exhibit, they go nuts. Okay? That's fundamentally altering that particular program. It's changing everything because that's not how wolves act, typically. I came as a zoo patron to see how wolves interact and how they do their... Okay, but when you bring a dog in and they go freaking crazy, then I'm not seeing what wolves really do. So we can make some provisions and say, I'm sorry, but no animals would be allowed in this particular area. Okay, for these reasons. Rest of the zoo, no problem, but not in the wolf exhibit. All right, public entities may only exclude service animals if the dog is out of the control of the handler. And by out of control, I don't mean, whoo! Just because they barked once doesn't mean that they're out of control, but we have all seen it. That dog's going crazy. It's running around, it's sniffing everybody, it's just making you feel, and they're not controlling it. That's out of the control of the handler, and you may ask that animal to leave. Never the person, but the animal can be asked to be removed. Okay? Again, a momentary thing, we understand they're dogs, they're animals. They can't be perfect all the time. Momentary, as long as the handler can bring them back under control. Typically speaking, a service animal needs to be on a leash, but not always. Why not always? Because some service animals can't do their job if they're on a leash. If the job is to pick things up that I've dropped, or how can it do that if it's on a leash? I may not even know that I dropped it. So I'm 25 feet away. As I keep on moving, the dog runs back, picks up what I dropped, and brings it back to me. Okay? Can't be on a leash, but typically needs to be on a leash. Regardless, needs to be under the control of the handler at all times. So, Rex, come back. And he comes back immediately. That's under control. Okay? Can also be excluded if the animal is not housebroken. Okay? So if the animal's defecating or urinating on your floors, the animal can go. Okay? All right, public entities may not require any documentation such as proof that the animal has been certified, trained, or licensed as a service animal. And this is where people get angry on both sides of the coin. Why? Why don't they have to certify their animal? Why? Well, first off, the ADA specifically states that there are no certifications. There are no legitimate companies who can certify an animal as a service animal. I can find you 1,000 of them on the internet that if I send them $60, they will send me a badge or a vest or a certification card, and they will tell me that I am certified under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Does that make everybody happy? Yeah, you know what? A lot of people who use service animals do just that. Just for that reason, because it keeps people from harassing them. They just whip out the card and go, here you go, I'm certified. There are no certifications, none, zip, zero, zilch. They don't have to put a badge on them that says I'm a service animal. Why? Because then that means that I am telling everybody who sees me that I am disabled. I am not required to self-disclose. Okay? Do you just self-disclose that you have blue eyes? Not unless you ask. Okay? There are no certifications. I just want to make that very, very clear. No certifications under the Americans with Disabilities Act. None. When it is not apparent. So again, I'm walking in, I've got sunglasses, I've got a cane, I've got an animal with me. Might you assume that I am blind? You might. So when it's not apparent, though, you may ask two questions of people who are using an animal at that point. You can ask them, is this a service animal? Okay? Or, fancy way, is this animal required because of a disability? Yes? Okay? That's the answer you're going to get. I don't care what it is. Right? They got an animal, they're probably going to tell you, yes. And then you may ask them, what work or task has this animal been trained to do? That's it. I know it feels like your hands are tied. I understand that. I'm sorry, but that is the reality of the situation. Typically, the response would be something like, is this a service animal? Yes. What task has this animal been trained to do? What picks things up for me? Oh, do you have a back problem? Okay, you've gone too far. Because now you're asking about the specific disability, and you're asking questions that you don't need to know the answers to. All you need to know is this a service animal, and what animal or what task has this animal been trained to do? All right, so the other part of the coin is usually it goes with something like this. Is this a service animal? Yes. What task has this animal been trained to do? I have PTSD and it calms me down. Okay, and anybody who's dealt in the public and asked the questions, you're probably going, that's it, that's the one. Okay? That is not a task. Unless the animal has been trained to identify when they're stressed and when they're at their peak and do something about it, it's not an animal, it's not a service animal. No protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act. None. A lot of people get very confused by that. As the handler, if I am reaching for the animal, I am the one providing the task, not the animal. So it's not covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Okay? Again, can't ask about the nature or extent of an individual's disability. That's usually where it goes wrong, where you just go, oh no, are you blind? Oh no, do you have a back problem? Usually it's sympathetic, but now you're asking too many questions. Okay? The ADA does not restrict the breed of an animal, or of a service animal. So just because a municipality says you cannot have pit bulls in this area does not mean that if I have a pit bull as my service animal, you still have to allow it. You cannot exclude a breed as a service animal. Okay? Can you exclude a specific animal? Yeah. You have the right on a case-by-case basis. So if you have specific knowledge that this pit bull attacked a child last week and is still pending litigation, yes, you can exclude that one because you have specific knowledge of that animal, but not the breed. Okay? And I bring that up because many places do have laws that prevent specific breeds. I know Denver, for example, has you can't have pit bulls in the city of Denver. Okay. The ADA has no provisions for animals in training. I know that seems odd. How do you get to be a service animal if you've never been through training? I don't know why I don't have the answers for it. I just know that the Americans with Disabilities Act does not have provisions for animals in training. It has to be a full-on service animal, trained to do a specific task for a person's disability. I will point out, though, that many state laws do. And in this particular case, the state would take over and say, yeah, under the state law. So in Colorado, service animals in training are treated exactly like service animals. So why, if that's so clear, I mean, I think that's pretty darn clear. I didn't leave a lot of gray areas in there. There may be some questions you still have based off of experiences, but typically I think that's pretty clear what the ADA has to say. So why is it so hard? Why are service animals such a big topic? Because they're not the only law out there. Okay? For example, fair housing. The Fair Housing Act covers privately owned housing and does allow for comfort and therapy animals. So if I go to rent an apartment or rent somewhere and I have a comfort or therapy animal, it has protection under that law. When you look at things like Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, state and local government programs, including publicly owned and operated housing, colleges and universities. So I'm at the dormitory at the college, or the university, and I have one set of rules that says I can have an emotional support animal. Then I step out onto the campus itself and I walk through the common areas, and the ADA takes over and says you can't have an emotional or support animal out here, bring them back to your dorm. Why is it so confusing? Because there are multiple laws involved. Then there's the Air Carriers Act. Air Carriers Act is totally different. So the ADA covers the person as they walk through the parking lot and through the airport, but once I step onto the plane, the Air Carriers Act kicks in. Air Carriers Act says pretty much anything that you can put on this plane can be or a service animal. I literally can have a service turkey. No problems. No problems at all. Okay? But it only applies while I'm on the aircraft. And then we have state and local laws. They often provide different coverages. And then we have flat-out misunderstandings by the public as a whole. Okay? It would be assumed that if I go to my doctor and my doctor writes me a prescription for something, that I am perfectly within my rights to take it, right? If he writes me a prescription for Xanax, can I take Xanax? Sure. I mean, my wife has Xanax and I start popping them, bad, okay? Because you got no prescription, Chris. You got no right to be taking Xanax. So you would assume that if my doctor writes me a prescription that says I can have an emotional or support or therapy animal because I think that would be beneficial to you and it would help to keep you grounded, that I would have the ability to bring that animal with me. Okay? And in some cases, that is the absolute truth. In others, not so much. Because the Americans with Disabilities Act says, no, it's an emotional support animal, it's not covered. But again, Air Carrier said, sure, why not? Fair Housing said, okay. So there is confusion out there. All right. We don't really have time for a break. But I do. Maybe we could bring up the lights for a second. Maybe we could get everybody to stand up for a second, stretch it out. I'm going to give you like 2 minutes just in case you had to run to the bathroom or something like that. Give you like 2 minutes just to stretch it out, and then we're going to kind of kick it off, okay? Sorry, I'm really condensing this so that you guys get not sitting here all day. All right. Final thing we want to talk about today is employment, okay? Whether you are somebody who hires, in which case you have responsibilities, or somebody who wants a job, okay? You have rights. So this should apply to everyone in this room, because most of us are not independently wealthy. I'm still waiting for that moment, but right now I'm not, and I still have to have a job. So let's talk about Title I. Oh yeah, keep in mind, we provide guidance, not legal advice. We're not going to worry about our total objectives because we're going to move quick. Okay? We know that the Americans with Disability Act prohibits employment discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities. Okay? So the Americans with Disabilities Act, it prohibits employment discrimination against people with disabilities. If y'all can remember that, you've done everything you need to do. Mic drop, and I'm out. Yeah! Right. Wish it was that easy. So who has responsibilities under Title I? Title I being all about employment? Well, everyone pretty much. Private employers, state and local governments, all the way down to labor unions. Okay? Since 1994, covered entities are those that have 15 or more employees. Okay, those can be part-time employees, yes. And when you start talking about the question of seasonal employees, could be. We'd have to calculate how many hours they actually worked. Most employers fall into this realm. Okay? Just to make sure that we are clear, when I say employer, I am referring to anyone who has any power or authority. So every manager, every supervisor, every foreman, even agencies that you might hire to do things like, background checks. Okay? All have responsibilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So who's covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act? An individual with a disability who meets the skills, experience, education, and other job-related requirements of a position. Bottom line is, regardless, if I don't have the experience to do the job or the requirements that go into the job, I can't get hired. It doesn't matter whether I have a disability or don't. Doesn't matter. Doesn't change anything. If you need somebody who's going to review architectural designs and for structural, I have no degree. I have nothing that's going to help you. I am not qualified for that job. Okay? Whether or not I have a disability makes no bit of difference. So qualifications are very important. Okay? A person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially, oh yeah, we already know that one, hopefully. Again, we already know there's a record. Okay? Qualified being the huge, big, massive word. If they're not qualified, can't be hired for the job. So when we look at qualified, though, we can look and see, does the person have the educational experience, work experience, training, skills, licenses, certificates that are required of every applicant? Again, if you're going to bend the rules, though, and you're going to say, well, you need to have 4 years of work experience in this particular field in order to qualify for this job. Great. That's great. Across the board. That's fantastic. Okay? And you can apply that unilaterally. However, if you're going to make exceptions for some people that only have 3 years, well, then we've got another issue. Okay. We also need to determine, and this is where it's going to get sticky, we need to determine what are the essential functions of a job. Okay? What are the essential job functions? This gets a little hard sometimes, because what we think a job, what are the essential functions of a job, aren't always what they truly are. We're going to get into that in a minute. Okay. Again, as I've said before, when it comes to the ADA, Title I covers everything from where you initially apply for a job, sometimes even slightly before that, when it comes to where we're going to do a job fair, all the way down to the company softball team. So all of your benefits, your compensations, your terminations, your medical examinations, your hirings, your disciplinary actions, all of that is covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Some basic examples that constitute discrimination would be limiting, segregating, or classifying a job applicant or employee in a way that adversely affects employment opportunities, refusing to make reasonable accommodations. We talked about that just a second ago, but those common sense changes to the known physical or mental limitations for a qualified applicant or employee, denying employment opportunities to a qualified individual because of the relationship with an individual who has a disability. Okay? Failing to use things like pre-employment tests in the most effective manner, pre-employment screenings, when you're calling to do oh my gosh, totally lost my words for a second. References, there we go. When you're calling to make reference checks, I can't start asking about your disability. Oh, they missed a lot of time, huh? Why? Oh, they had cancer. Okay, you didn't need to know that. You shouldn't have asked that question. Okay? Was it fine to ask if they missed a lot of time? Sure. Was it excused? Yes. Okay, all I needed to know. Can't discriminate a person because they oppose an employment practice or policy from a previous employer or even you. All right, let's get into this essential job functions. This is important, okay? Because this is what everything is all about. Everything, when it comes to the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title I, almost everything seems to revolve back to essential job functions. What it really takes to do the job. The essential functions. In order to determine if a person is qualified for a job, you can only base your decisions really on the essential functions of the job, not the extra fluffy stuff. So like I know within my office, and I'm just going to give you an example, in my office, we have one of those water coolers with the big old 5-gallon water jug, okay? And when I got hired, they say, hey, Chris, could you, as part of your, can you once a week, can you make sure that there's a new water jug on there? I said, sure, no problem. Okay? But if I had a disability that prevented me from lifting that water jug, do you think they could have denied me employment? No. They shouldn't, because that would be discrimination. Because lifting the water jug is not an essential function of my job. Creating training material is. Okay? If it's not essential, it is a marginal function, and we do not really consider it. When we want to figure out if something is an essential function of a job, we have to determine whether or not does the position exist to perform that function. So as a training consultant, creating training material is an essential function. Okay? It's why the job exists. For example, a person who is hired to proofread documents, the ability to proofread accurately is an essential function of the job. Would make sense, you're a proofreader. Another thing that we'd want to factor in, key factors, would be how many other employees can do the same function. So lifting that water jug, if there's 5 other people in the office that can all lift that water jug, is it an essential function of my job? Probably not, because if I can't do it, somebody else will. If Chris happens to be traveling this week and they need water, somebody's going to put that up there, right? Is the function highly specialized? Okay, so a lot of times we go, the job may not exist specifically to have this particular function. However, if Chris is the only one in here that knows how to reset the servers on the computer, okay, that could be an essential function, resetting the servers on the computer. Written job descriptions are not required under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But I will tell you this. Written job descriptions can be used for an employer's benefit if somebody's trying to claim later on, well, I didn't know that I had to do this, and they're trying to claim that you're discriminating against them. You can produce a job description that says, hey, this was what the job description was, right? They knew darn well that this was in the job description. We didn't hide it. It's right here in the job description. Okay? Certainly can be used in those respects. On the reverse side of it, an employee can use that too. This is what the job description says. And now you're adding to it and you're putting this stuff in here that wasn't supposed to. Written job descriptions are not a requirement, but they can be utilized. Okay? When you're trying to determine what the essential functions of the job are or were. Another thing that we'd want to look at when we're trying to determine essential functions, or is this an essential function, is how much time is spent performing the act. So if 90% of my day is spent creating training material, it's probably an essential function. But that's not to say that something that only happens occasionally can't be an essential function. Because again, if part of my essential functions, one of the things on my list of why we're hiring you is I reset the servers when they go down, well, I only do that like 0.1% of my day. Okay? It very rarely happens. But if it doesn't, it's bad. Okay? All of our websites crash and life is no good. Okay? Bottom line is, what would be the consequences if the action wasn't performed? Okay? So again, in the case of the water jug, the consequences of me not lifting the water jug is somebody else lifts the water jug. If the consequences of not resetting the servers is that our website crashes, that's pretty big. Okay, because I'm the only one that knows how to do that. That's not true. I have nothing to do with websites or servers. Okay, there are some provisions in there for terms of collective bargaining agreements. Okay? So if you already have a collective bargaining agreement, most of us don't have to deal with this, but if you did. And sometimes when they're trying to determine what the essential functions of the job are, we can look back and see what others who have done the job, what their job requirements were. Okay, so we can use previous experiences. But that's not to say, because again, everybody does it differently. So it's not an absolute, it's just that we can. We can take into consideration the employer's judgment when we want to try to figure out what are essential functions of a job. Once we have determined, though, what the essential functions of a job are, everything else that happens is just marginal. So I'm just going to try to summarize this the best I can, because this is typically a 2-hour class all on its own. But let's say I was hired, and part of my job was administrative. Okay, I answer phones, I do basic stuff, no problems, no issues. But it would be very beneficial to have me run to the post office from time to time. Okay, very beneficial. It would be nice. But there are other people that can do it. Nobody's gonna die if I don't run to the post office. Can we say that running to a post office is an essential function? No, we can't. That's just something that happens. Yay, it's a nice thing that Chris can do from time to time, but it's not a requirement of his job. So if I was going to hire somebody to now replace Chris, do I determine or do I base my decision off of who has a car? No, I don't. Because driving to the post office was not an essential function of my job. Okay? I base my decisions off of who can answer the phone, who can type up the memos, who can do the other aspects of it, the truly essential functions of a job. That's all I really wanted to kind of get at. Can essential functions change? Of course they can change. Life changes, things happen. As long as we know what the essential functions are and they're communicated, and we take into consideration reasonable modifications. I'm not going to get into this right now, but now that we know what an essential function hopefully is, we have to look at whether or not a job can be modified or how we can accomplish it. So if Chris is blind, but I'm hired to proofread documents, was that going to work? Can I have a job blind and proofread documents? Sure. All I need is a screen reader. I just need you to produce that document electronically so that I can see it or hear it on my screen reader. I can still do the same job, no problems. But providing me a screen reader, just a reasonable modification. It's just a common sense approach. Hey, Chris, what you need to get this job done? You seem to have plenty of experience when it comes to being a proofreader. What you going to need? I'm going to need a screen reader. Preferred JAWS. Great, no problem. We got you covered. Okay? I have all the other qualifications. I can do the essential functions of the job. Oh, but hey, Chris, by the way, we also want you to make trips to the post office from time to time, so you're going to need to have a driver's license and a car. Oh, okay, no. Now we've gone too far. Okay? Because that's not an essential function. But let's assume for a second that it was an essential function of my job, driving to the post office. And Chris comes to apply, and Chris is blind. And you say to yourself, I am not even going to interview this, because how the heck is he going to get to the post office? He can't do it. He got no driver's license. Can't be done. Do you know that for sure? Do you know that I'm just not independently wealthy somewhere and I have a personal driver so my driver is a reasonable accommodation? I don't know. If I'm qualified, we'll look and see, are there any reasonable accommodations that can help me meet the essential functions of a job? So a reasonable accommodation is any accommodation or modification or adjustment to a job, a work practice, or work environment that makes it possible for an individual with a disability to enjoy equal opportunity, employment opportunity. Again, it's just that common sense approach. What can we do? What are you going to need so that you can continue to function in this job? Go back into my office for a second, because it's the world I know the best. But again, Paul is deaf. Okay? We have meetings. Just to have a meeting doesn't do Paul a whole lot of good. But Paul has VRI. He has the video remote interpreting. He's got his little iPad, so he comes into the meeting. And the interpreter is hearing what we're saying on the iPad. She's interpreting to Paul. Great. Is that VRI a reasonable modification? Sure it is. Fantastic. And it lets Paul participate in our meeting, because now he can respond back and all is right and everything's good with the world. Okay? Reasonable modification. Paul also has VRI on his telephone, so that if you call him to ask a question or I transfer a call to him, he can answer it just like everyone else. No problems, no harm, no foul. Okay? Just a reasonable modification. Not going to get into this one too much. If you want more, contact us at the ADA Center. Keep in mind, when it comes to reasonable accommodations, it could be anywhere from the employment or the application process all the way down to the benefits. I need you to maybe move that softball game to a field that's accessible, because I can't get my wheelchair up that big old steep hill. Okay? And that park is not accessible. When it comes to reasonable accommodations, I do want to kind of point out, it just has to be effective. It doesn't always have to be exactly what I'm asking for. Let me give you an example. So Chris has a back injury, okay? I have difficulty sitting for a long period of time, okay? Typically, my job involves sitting in front of a computer monitor all day long, typing, okay? Typing, clicking, doing my thing. But I can't sit there that long. So Chris says, I would like a stand-up desk. Great. And the stand-up desk that I want, it's $3,500. Okay, because it has heated things where I can put my feet, and it surrounds me in cool comfort gel, and it's great, and it adjusts hydraulically, and okay. I want a $3,500 stand-up desk. And my employer goes, really? How about I call in the carpenter and I have him some 2x4s and I have him lift your current desk up to standing height. Okay? How's that sound? $50, we out the door. Well, but it doesn't have the cooling gel and it doesn't have the surround sound, but that's functional, right? My goal was to have a stand-up desk. That's what I needed. Not to say it's always that simple, but the bottom line is, can we come to something that achieves your goal and your needs and meets my budget? Yes, sometimes we can. Okay? It doesn't always have to be the best accommodation, but it does have to be effective. As an employer, you're not required to provide anything for personal use. So, I have a hard time hearing in the meetings, Chris. So, what I'd like you to buy me is a new hearing aid. Okay, no, because that's primarily for your use. Unless you plan to take it off when you leave the meeting and leave it in the box, I don't really need to buy you a hearing aid. Okay, that's for your use. Again, there are no ADA requirements to say you can't go above and beyond. Just bottom line, make it effective. When people need something, listen. Okay? So how do you know when an employee needs an accommodation, or how do you address it? Tell them. the employee should tell you. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, employers are not required to be mind readers. If they do not know that you need something, they cannot give it to you. They are not required to give it to you, and they won't give it to you. Okay? If you want something, you have to tell them. You have to tell your employer, this is what I need. Okay? But employers, you have a responsibility. You need to post notices in conspicuous places that say, hey, if you need an accommodation, if you need something that'll help you, we'll do it. Here's how you go about it. Here's how you tell us. It must be a place that is seen by all applicants. When it comes to, I want an accommodation, can the employer request documentation to prove that that accommodation is necessary? Actually, yes, if the accommodation isn't obvious. So if I'm blind and I'm asking you for a screen reader, you might go, well, you ask me to bring in some documentation that a screen reader is going to help you, and I'm going to go, really? Okay, but if I am saying, I got a back injury and I need a stand-up desk, and you go, that's not funny, because you just seemed to be telling everybody in the office last week about how you saw a news article about how stand-up desks make everything so much better. Okay? Yes, you could ask me to bring in documentation. Not that I have an injury or that I have a disability, but you can ask me for documentation that the accommodation you're asking for will assist your disability. So I'm blind, I want a stand-up desk. Does that two coordinate? Do they correlate? Nope, not at all. The doctor goes, well, stand-up desk, how's that going to help you, Chris? No. Okay. Who can provide the documentation? I do want to point this one out big time. Everybody says, go get a doctor's note. Please, oh my gosh. It's not just a doctor. Doctors are great. Okay, but it could also be a psychologist, a rehabilitation counselor, occupational or physical therapist, an independent living specialist. It can be any professional who has intimate knowledge of the person and how something is going to assist their disability. Let's face facts. My wife's doctor during breast cancer, knew quite a bit about her, but the nurse knew more. The nurse knew way more. So if I'm asking the doctor about something that would help her, he might just go, sure. But the nurse knew better. When she was going through physical therapy, did the physical therapist know more about her than the doctor at that point? Yeah, he could tell you what her ranges of motion were, and he could tell you all the different stuff. The doctor couldn't tell you that. What he could tell you is, yes, she's going to physical therapy. So it doesn't always have to be a doctor's note. All right, so how do you determine what is a reasonable accommodation? First, you consult with the person, okay? Then you work together in what is honestly described in the Americans with Disabilities Act as the informal process, or the interactive process, The interactive process. This is where the employer and employee sit down to come out with a solution that'll work. A lot of times this is highly ignored. Okay? This is ignored because the employee says, here's what I need. The employer goes, yes or no. That's it. End of conversation. We're done here. And the employee is left going, huh? It's not how the Americans with Disabilities Act was set up. It was set up to say, great, now you guys go sit down and see what's going to really work. Unless you can just grant it, fabulous. But if you can't grab it, sit down and grant it, sit down and have an informal conversation about what will work. Again, just in general, I'm going to kind of summarize, but do make sure that if you are not going to fulfill a reasonable or an accommodation request, and it is based on finances, you better make sure that you have really exhausted all of your opportunities. And that includes things like your tax credits and other incentive programs that are out there, because otherwise you could be in a world of problems. If you just say, nope, can't be done, it's not going to bode well. All right, earlier, do you remember all my absolutes? Do you remember how clear and concise I was about the Americans with Disabilities Act when it comes to service animals? Do you remember that? Hopefully you do. So a service animal is a dog. It's been individually trained. It can help people, blah, blah, blah. We cannot have any other species of animals. It has to be a dog. Emotional support animals are not considered service animals under the ADA. Everybody remember that? God, you guys are so quiet. Hopefully you do, because here's my question. An employee has an anxiety disorder. Their doctor has recommended that they keep a rabbit near them to help calm them. Okay? The rabbit's fluffy, and it's been housebroken. Does this rabbit qualify as a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act? I'm going to make you guys actually do something physical here. So everybody who agrees that this animal is covered now as a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act, raise your hand. You agree that this is a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Okay, everybody who has their hand down right now, shame on you. Put your heads down and... No, shouldn't be shame. To be honest with you, if you listen to what I said, it made sense, right? Americans with Disabilities Act, very specific. Now we're talking about Americans with Disabilities Act, should be very specific. Wrong. Okay, when we talk about Title I, employment, a reasonable accommodation could be anything. So a reasonable accommodation bunny is perfectly fine. Okay? You no longer your little animal no longer has to be specifically trained for a specific task. All I know is, as an employee, I sometimes have panic attacks. When I have panic attacks, I don't work. When I don't work, I get in trouble. Okay? Or work just stops. It doesn't matter. I don't know. Maybe the boss doesn't hold me accountable. But it's not a good thing. So the doctor says, here, hold the bunny. And the bunny helps me work. Okay? The bunny helps me work. Don't we have? Oh, I guess so. In those particular cases, employment only, anything could be a reasonable accommodation. I'm not going to get into undue hardship. We already talked about all that. Bottom line, do the math. Make sure that if you're going to say it's an undue hardship, that it's a person who is director or above who has financial. We can get into all the specifics, but I don't think anybody really wants to. I'm not dumb. We get the bottom line. Let's use common sense. Let's make sure that we are focusing on including everyone. When the Americans with Disabilities Act when it was first passed, the whole idea was not about rules, not about regulations. It was about making sure that we included everyone. And with that, I am going to turn this over.
Thank you, Chris. Please give Chris a round of applause.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and start this next session. So our next speaker is Dallas Dietrich. He is overall described as an advocate for people with disabilities. But I couldn't stand up here and just leave it at just that. Yesterday, when I talked to Dallas, I asked him, how did you want me to introduce you today? He's like, just give me a one-liner saying I'm an advocate for people with disabilities. So, but I can't just stand up here and do that. I learned a little bit more about Dallas online, and he has an amazing story, and so I want to kind of give you a little bit of background so you know who our next speaker is. So here we go. Dallas, who has been an avid skier and outdoor enthusiast for years, started his charitable work back in 1978 when he became part of the Rapid City Mayoral Committee for Employment with People with Disabilities. Dallas is one of 6 people that started Ski for Light, a skiing experience for people with disabilities held at Deer Mountain Ski Area. However, things took a turn on January 4th, 1997, when a semi-trailer crashed into the rear of his car on I-90 near Mitchell during a blizzard. The crash injured Dallas, causing a spinal cord injury, injured his wife, Mary, who had serious but non-life-threatening injuries, and killed their 2 children, Derek and Don, and also Don's husband, Joseph. However, Dallas did not throw in the towel from this unfortunate event. Dallas still has the same cheerful, positive attitude he had before this accident. In fact, Dallas and Mary bought a tiny town of Otho. By show of hands, how many of you know where Otho's at? I've lived here in Rapid City my whole life and never knew about it. Otho is a small tin mining town that was operated in the late 1800s near Keystone. Together, they turned the town into a fully functioning camp that serves as an amazing destination place for people with disabilities. If you want to check out more about this, go to Google and you can search it, or just go to meetingtheneed.com. It's pretty neat. Dallas is now part of the Civic Center Task Force ADA Subcommittee, and that's why we've asked him here today, is to talk to you a little bit about that and tell his story. This, I'm sure, is not all there is to know about Dallas, but now I hope you know a little bit about our next speaker. So please help me welcome Dallas Dietrich.
Holy cow, Trevor, you make it sound like I walk on water. Being alive. Well, that about covers it. Any questions? Well, this time of day, you know, I know it's getting long, and my dad was an insurance agent in Montana, and he would go to meetings twice a year. And so when he got back from one of those meetings, I said, you know, how'd the meeting go? And he said, they just don't understand. The mind can only absorb as much as the butt can stand. So here we are, late afternoon, and I really feel bad that they asked me to talk for an hour. Don't everybody run out the back door at the same time. I was across the street at Central High School about a month ago, and we were talking about aging gracefully. That was the name of the symposium. And so I was there representing Meeting the Need at our booth. And this elderly gentleman came up and he said, you know, aging is like a roll of toilet paper. And he says, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, you know, the closer you get to the end, the faster it goes. So there we have the aging process, and I guess that's where my gray hair comes from. Oftentimes people do ask me about how I got involved with helping people with disabilities, and I was the placement director at National College for 17 years, and I traveled around the country getting companies like Walt Disney World and American Airlines to come into Rapid City and to hire our graduates. And so I traveled all around and did that, and in addition to that, then in those days, in the late 70s, there was the Vietnam era veterans coming back, and National College was recruiting these guys to come to school there. Well, National College wanted to be the first educational institution of higher learning that was fully accessible. And so there he said there's this newly formed committee that Mayor LaCroix has started, and it's called, you know, the Mayor's Committee for Employment of the Handicapped. So get your butt over there and help us out. So I got volunteered to serve on the Mayor's Committee for Employment of the Handicapped. And one of the things that we did was, you know, long before ADA, the mayor wanted to come up with curb cuts and designated handicap parking places. So I was downtown talking to a business person and telling him what a good deal this was, and he looked at me and he said, Dallas, he said, I'm not giving up a perfectly good parking place for some damn cripple that isn't going to spend any money anyway. And I started laughing because I thought he was joking, but he wasn't. And so that was the attitude of a lot of folks, and I felt at that time that the disabled community needed my help. And so I vowed at that time that I would do everything I could to help the disabled community. Along about that time, there was another group that had approached the mayor's committee, and that was the Ski for Light International. And Ski for Light International brought visually impaired people from France and Norway and England, and so they needed to raise $50,000 right quick like. And I thought, well, heck, I can do that, and I don't mind twisting some arms to raise some money for a good cause. And so we got that done, and then they said, no, we're short of guides. And they said, you want to ski with a blind person? And I said, well, I've never skied with a blind person before. And they said, well, that's good. We'll give you somebody that's never skied before. So we got along. Rusty and I he was from Sioux Falls, by the way. And Rusty and I got along great, and we really enjoyed that. And we were clicking along and starting Black Hills Regional Ski for Light, because when it was over, we thought, wow, this is so much fun. Let's start a regional program. So we started Black Hills Regional Ski for Light, the 6 of us, the owner of Deer Mountain, and 5 of us guys each had an area of expertise, and so we made it happen. The Ski for Light Black Hills Regional is the second, the oldest in the country, and it is the largest, and so we were very proud of that. And somehow we got recognized for our volunteer effort. The first 1,000 days of President Bush's, the former President Bush, you know, the old guy? Yeah, he recognized the different volunteer efforts by starting a Point of Light program. And the Point of Light program basically was recognizing volunteer efforts nationwide. And so for the first 1,000 days then, he recognized a different group, and we were honored to be recognized as the 80th Point of Light, so we were number 80. And we were very proud of that, and it continued to help us in our fundraising, knowing that we were recognized for the volunteer effort. And not long after that, I was in a meeting, and Sheila came and found me, and she said, say, we got an important phone call for you. So I said, okay. So I stepped out of the meeting and went and answered my phone, and this guy says, this is John from the Office of National Service, and the president is requesting your presence on the South Lawn in the 28th of August. And I was thinking, that's only 6 days off. Holy cow. But then I thought, which one of my derelict friends is pulling my chain? The White House would never call us. So I said, well, I'm in a meeting right now. Can you call me at home in 2 hours? And the guy said, sure. So I go home. I never go home for lunch, but I went home that day thinking, you know, it was going to be the end of it. Well, the phone rings, and this guy says, is now a good time? And I said, yeah, absolutely. I said, by the way, what's the area code for Washington, D.C.? And he said, 202. And I thought, wow, my friends are really getting good at this. As it turns out, it really was the White House, and I jerked them around. I did jerk them around a little bit, but they got over it. So they invited 3 of us then to witness ADA being signed into law. And I couldn't even spell ADA back in those days, so I had no idea what we were getting in for. But once we got back to Rapid City, and we thought, you know, this is a pretty good thing. So I was reading in the newspaper not long ago that the mayor had appointed a task force to look into the Civic Center and the future of the Barnett Arena, and of course some of the ADA issues. So what do? I go down to the mayor's office, and I say, you don't have any short people on that task force. They got what I was talking about, and here we are. So I'll never open my mouth again, that's for sure. I ended up being on the subcommittee for the ADA portion of the task force. And what we were looking at as far as the ADA issues in the Civic Center here is there was quite a long list of things that were non-compliant with ADA standards. So we started tackling those, and some of them were quite simple, and others weren't quite so simple at all. But some of the issues that the Department of Justice looked at was that the seating area didn't have 1 and 12 going up the ramp to the seating area. The water fountains protruded from the wall, and they needed to be addressed because it could be a problem for visually impaired folks. Some of the restrooms needed to have widened stalls, and some of the handrails were not ADA size-wise, so they basically had to be changed. The handrails weren't the right height, nor were they the right diameter, which didn't make a lot of sense to me. But anyway, we addressed that list. And then along with that, there was life safety issues. And the life safety issues could be like egress in the event of a fire. So if there was a fire in the Civic Center, getting folks out so they didn't get toasted. So we were looking at those issues. And then comes the final prong of what we were doing, and that is the marketability study. And the marketability study, had 3 scenarios. We were, number one, looking at cost and trying to figure out what a return on investment would be for the 3 scenarios. So the first scenario would be that we do renovations, and it's a given that we have to address the life safety issues, and we have to address the ADA compliant issues. So if, say, that was $100, then if we spent $200, then what would we get for that as far as different venues that we could attract to the Barnett Arena, and different things that we could do to show a return on investment of the additional costs that we would spend. And then the second issue would be doing nothing. And that would mean basically not doing anything beyond taking care of life safety and the ADA compliance issues. And then the third scenario would be building a new facility and spending the money to take a look at attracting other venues, so that we would be spending quite a bit more money to build a new facility. So the timeline on that is basically January, when we'll have the numbers put together, and then we'll be making a recommendation to the mayor, and of course the mayor will bring that on to the city council. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of what we're looking at. And unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions. No, I'm just kidding. If you have any questions for me, feel free to ask. I might want to point out that you can email questions to civiccentertaskforce@gmail.com. civiccentertaskforce@gmail.com. Do you have any questions? Not even one question? Holy cow. Thank you so much for your attention.